Today's speaker, Nathan Citino, comes to us from Colorado State University, where he is the Associate Professor of History, and he's on the editorial board of a scholarly journal called Diplomatic History. He has a PhD from Ohio State University, and he has a book called From Arab Nationalism to OPEC, Eisenhower, King Saud, and the Making of U.S.-Saudi Relations. More recently, he's gotten interested in modernization in U.S.-Arab relationship between 1945 and 1973. So he's a historian who does international relations. The title of Dr. Citino's talk today is The Crush of Ideologies, the United States, the Arab World, and Cold War Modernization. Please welcome Nathan Citino.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you for the Center for American Studies and Research for inviting me to AUB. This is my first time in Beirut, and I'm delighted to be here, especially because where I'm from in Colorado, we had 8 inches of snow last week. This is much more pleasant by comparison. I'll be sharing some of my current work on U.S.-Arab relations during the Cold War. And by current, I mean in progress and, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. In progress and unfinished. So I welcome your comments during the question and answer period, and I hope we'll get the opportunity to have a conversation here at the end. My talk will be a presentation of my research, but it will also be somewhat autobiographical. It'll also be the story of how I came to think about my own relationship to the fields of U.S. foreign relations history and Middle Eastern history, the fields in which I was trained. The argument that you'll hear me make tonight is that Cold War historians, despite their recent emphasis on what they call the Third World, focus too exclusively and with too little context on the ideological rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. They neglect the other modernizing ideologies that competed with American liberalism and Soviet communism to define the future of developing areas. I also question Cold War historians' account of American modernization theory, the dominant social science approach to development during the Cold War, during the 1950s and 60s, a set of ideas associated with people such as Daniel Lerner and Walt Rostow. Recent scholarship has portrayed modernization theory essentially as an outgrowth of American liberalism. Scholars associate it with the anti-populism and faith in technocratic authority that characterized post-war liberal thought in the United States. But I think that historians from my field, U.S. foreign relations, offer too provincial an account of modernization theory and American approaches to development in the period after 1945. In particular, they ignore what post-war modernization theorists, post-war modernizers from America shared with those from developing societies, particularly their anti-democratic tendencies. The implication of my arguments is that although the Cold War was a global conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, its meaning and consequences can be understood only in local and regional contexts. Understanding it in this way requires a dialogue between Cold War scholars and historians with regional expertise. This collaboration is already well underway and reflected in the kind of research that's going on right now under the label international history, research that tends to be multi-archival, multilinguistic. With respect to the Middle East, specialists in U.S. foreign relations and historians of the Middle East have lately been converging. This is because a small but growing number of American foreign policy scholars are training in the region's history and languages. It's also the case, happily I think, because in the last several years, certainly since September 11, 2001, Middle East historians have taken a new interest in the history of America's regional influence. They've begun to analyze that role in the way that Middle East historians have long studied the place of the traditional imperial powers, Britain and France, in the region's history. As someone trained in Middle Eastern history and with a reading knowledge of Arabic, I've focused on understanding the complicated ways in which the Cold War intersected with decolonization and the struggle for development in the Arab world after 1945. This intersection, I believe, can best be approached by examining modernizing Arab elites, their encounter with the United States, and their interaction with American modernizers who, at least so far in my field, have tended to monopolize the story. So after a brief discussion of existing scholarship, the first part of my talk places the American Cold War approach to modernization in the context of contemporary Arabic literature from across a political spectrum, and this includes writings by Islamists and by secular Arab nationalists. It shows how Islamists and Arab nationalists also, like American modernizers, invoked America to define their visions for the future. Like US Cold Warriors, Arab modernizers saw America's historical path as instructive and useful for understanding development, but unlike their US counterparts, they did not regard the American experience as paradigmatic, in other words, a model to be emulated. Rather, Arab writers used accounts of America to map out what they saw as better futures than what Washington had to offer. The second part, the latter part of my talk then, provides, that as prologue, provides an illustration of how American and Arab modernizers interacted and of what ideas they shared. It reconsiders US policy toward the Arab world in the context of a multi-sided ideological battle to develop the Arab Middle East. I feature the Cold War US official who enjoyed the widest contacts in this region, William Rowe Polk. A Harvard Arabist before joining the State Department's Policy Planning Council in 1961, Polk studied Arab modernization and discussed its challenges in intimate and wide-ranging conversations with leaders such as the Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Citing Polk's relationships, I conclude that modernization was not an exclusively American ideology. Describing it in this way, I think, reinforces an exceptionalist interpretation of US liberalism that is as much an artifact of the Cold War as modernization theory itself. Rather, American and developing world elites shared an inclination to sacrifice democracy in the name of progress and claimed authority on the basis of their supposed ability to manage social change. So to begin as a way of sort of getting into the first part of the talk, I'll describe one Arab statesman's Cold War era encounter with the United States. And that person is the Syrian foreign minister during the 1950s, Khalid al-Azam, who comes from a famous and a very wealthy Damascus family. So the Syrian foreign minister, Khalid al-Azam, studied the star's handprints outside Grauman's Chinese Theater. And in his memoir, account of that experience, proclaimed Hollywood as epitomizing America's peculiarities. A leftist from the Syrian family that once governed Ottoman Damascus, al-Azam's presence in the setting where Marilyn Monroe had recently left her mark seems incongruous, seems strange. But al-Azam's experience, in important respects, typifies that of so-called third world elites during the Cold War. In 1955, he had been invited to San Francisco to attend the ceremonies marking the 10-year anniversary of the United Nations. And there he used the trip to seek economic aid from both superpowers and from the international development agencies. So at the UN festivities, he exchanged a handshake and how do you do with Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States. He met with the UN Secretary General at the time, Dag Hammarskjöld, World Bank President Eugene Black, and also the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. But as important as these official meetings were, was Al-Azm's experience of America itself. He traveled from New York to Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and while doing so, Al-Azm assessed America's economy, people, culture, and even its food. He was savage about America's cuisine. But in doing this, he put to the test Americans' claim to offer a model to developing societies. The foreign minister repeated this performance 2 years later on a trip to the Soviet Union, where the favorable impression left by the Soviets' hydroelectric dams, natural resources, and artistic treasures validated his decision to conclude an economic aid agreement with Moscow instead of the United States. It would be easy to situate this episode, this story, Khalid al-Azm, in the conventional bipolar framework of superpower competition for the third world. That's how people in my field would tell that story. A third world statesman maneuvering between the two superpowers and ultimately tilting toward the Eastern Bloc because Moscow provided the better formula by which a developing country could overcome its colonial past. But al-Azm's own account of his career challenges such an interpretation. In his memoir, which is 3 volumes long, perhaps even longer and more self-serving than most political memoirs, al-Azm defines his politics with respect not to 2, but to 4 modernizing ideologies: pan-Arab nationalism, political Islam, American liberalism, and Soviet communism. So here's a different perspective on the Cold War when we stand in the shoes of a modernizer from the Arab world, if you will. Al-Azm bitterly criticized Abdel Nasser and Syria's union with Egypt in the United Arab Republic between 1958 and 1961 for turning Syria into, his words, an Egyptian colony. He castigated the Muslim Brotherhood for infighting and weakness, and he justified his own refusal of American aid while vigorously denying that he had embraced communism. So reading this kind of political literature, reading al-Azm's memoir and other contemporary Arabic political writings, reveals that post-war ideological competition in the Arab world encompassed the superpowers' rivalry, but it had many other layers and dimensions as well. I think that the US-Arab encounter deserves a fresh look in light of the recent work on Cold War history. New scholarship has moved post-colonial societies from the periphery to the center of Cold War history. In works like The Global Cold War by Alt Arne Westad, historians have portrayed the superpowers as contending to define modernity by demonstrating, Westad's words, the universal applicability of their ideologies in developing states. In other words, in Westad's account of the Cold War, it isn't Europe that's the main event. The main event, the most long-lasting and consequential aspect of the Cold War was the competition for the Third World. However, scholarship remains mostly concerned with this bipolar ideological conflict and doesn't adequately represent the perspectives of modernizers from the developing world, who, like Khalid al-Azm, confronted more ideological choices than just 2. Nor does recent literature describe this ideological competition in a way that relates Cold War era politics to their colonial era antecedents, what happens in the 1950s to what happened in the 1940s or 30s or earlier. Finally, historians can better explain the recent significance of Islamist movements by presenting political Islam as a contemporary and co-equal ideology with those of the two superpowers, rather than introducing, as historians in many existing accounts do, rather than introducing political Islam only as a late or post-Cold War reaction against them. In some international histories, Islamists sort of pop out in the 1970s and 1980s, seemingly out of nowhere. So moving beyond the standard topics in diplomatic histories about the Arab Middle East, regional defense, the development of oil resources, the conflict with Israel, offers an important opportunity, I think, for rethinking developing societies' experiences of the Cold War. To understand US policies toward the Third World, scholars in my field have studied modernization theory as, quote, a historical artifact of the Cold War. According to one of my colleagues, Michael Latham, modernization theory served as America's alternative ideology to Marxism-Leninism. It defined modernity as the opposite of tradition and envisioned American aid as hastening society's linear progress along a common path toward a universal model represented, naturally of course, by the United States. This path involved, quote, integrated and interdependent changes across societies reflected in media consumption, social mobility, and economic growth. Cold Warriors assumed that social science expertise could help them to channel historical forces in an anti-communist direction. Neither Michael Latham nor other recent scholars of modernization theory describes a rigid school of thought, but each portrays the ideas that the US tried to export during the Cold War essentially as an outgrowth of American liberalism, sort of the overseas edition of the Leave It to Beaver world of the 1950s that we tend to idealize. This scholarship I'm talking about criticizes how Cold Warriors thought about development and what it meant and how to achieve it, but it also shares some of Cold Warriors' assumptions. In particular, studies of Cold War modernization perpetuate an understanding of ideological conflict in the Third World as essentially bipolar, as essentially a two-sided contest, and a picture of America's overseas mission as the outgrowth of its exceptional liberalism, a kind of new version of this very old story that America has a unique mission in the world. The two linked perspectives in my talk on the Cold War in the Arab Middle East are intended to challenge these assumptions. So first, I'm going to give you some examples showing what Arab modernizers shared with their American Cold War era counterparts. And then I'll give you an illustration or an example of how this approach can lead to a new narrative about US-Arab relations during the Cold War, a new account of that relationship. So, reimagining the Cold War as a many-sided ideological battle, not just a two-sided contest, requires taking political Islam seriously as a 20th century modernizing ideology comparable to those promoted by the two superpowers. In the Arab world, the emergence of political Islam long predated the Cold War and developed as one of several movements resisting European colonialism. Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, established in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, competed for urban working-class recruits against other anti-colonial movements, including the secular nationalist Wafd and communist trade unions. The interwar years also witnessed vigorous political debate among Western educated and professional Egyptians and citizens from other Arab states as well, opposed to European imperialism. Despite the appeal of authoritarian ideologies, some historians have recently concluded that during the interwar period in the Arab world, many literate people participating in this debate rejected authoritarian visions of modernity. Competition within the crowded field of anti-colonial ideologies set the stage for the Cold War in the Arab world. It fostered modernizers' practice of defining their prescriptions, their formula, their ideas by way of negation, contrasting their programs with those of rival movements, and grouping ideological enemies together as symbols of tradition and reaction. So, to give you one example, during the Spanish Civil War, the leading Arab communist, a Syrian named Khalid Bakdash, warned Arabs about how General Francisco Franco recruited Moroccan Islamists to fascism by vowing to save Islam from communism. Right? So at this kind of ideological competition, you try to sort of win allies by grouping your enemies together, your ideological enemies together. This kind of tactic, honed in the political battles of the 1930s, conditioned Arab responses to the post-war superpower rivalry, when American prescriptions for Arab countries joined an ideological race that was already in progress. The conflation of one's political opponents became a sort of standard ploy in the Cold War era competition among ideological systems that each promised Arabs a brighter future. A prime example of this kind of response during the early Cold War years came from the Egyptian Islamist al-Bahi al-Khuli. His 1948 book, Islam, Neither Communism Nor Capitalism, presents both as worshiping materialist idols. Al-Khuli commends Islam as a socio-economic system to Egyptian youth facing what he called the crush, a zahma, of rival ideologies and theories. Al-Khuli describes Islam as a universal guide to human fulfillment that prefigured and transcended both Cold War ideologies. He rejects arguments that Islam should accommodate itself to one or the other of the superpowers' prescriptions, employing the metaphor of God's creation as a great table to which all are invited. Al-Khuli establishes Islamic law as a full-fledged guide to modern statecraft, including policies on labor, economic rights, and trade. The rise of American power in the Middle East insinuated the U.S. more directly than ever before into Arabs' conflicts and debates over development and modernization. In this context, political Islam and American-style modernization theory were comparable rivals. In a seminal 1952 study of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian political scientist Muhammad Shawki Zaki, who was supervised at Cairo University by a member of the Brotherhood, explicitly equated political Islam with the superpowers' ideologies. Long before Daniel Lerner described modernity in The Passing of Traditional Society as an interlocking system, Zaki portrayed the Brothers' Islamic message as a universal, all-encompassing social system. Khalid Bakdash, the Syrian communist, used exactly the same term in his post-war writings to talk about communism. Anticipating Walt Rostow's most famous work, Stages of Economic Growth, and its focus on non-revolutionary change, Zaki also outlined a progression of linear stages by which the Brotherhood sought to cultivate an Islamic society. Zaki stressed the fundamental social change that it pursued through its proselytizing, a grassroots transformation that his early research had tried to measure using public opinion surveys. This concern with mass opinion as the index of progress, a feature of Lerner's study, can also be found in the writings of post-war Islamists, including the leader of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's female auxiliary, Zainab al-Ghazali. The most significant basis for relating U.S. and Arab modernizers is their common, if divergent, use of America as a benchmark, as sort of the benchmark society or the society against which other societies should be measured. The most famous Islamist account in this regard is from Said Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood leader whom Nasser had executed in 1966. Qutb derived great authority from his personal experience in the US during his nearly 2-year educational mission in the late 1940s. The story of his revulsion at the sight of adolescents dancing immodestly to the song, "Baby, It's Cold Outside," following church services in Greeley, Colorado, has achieved the status of a fable. It keeps getting told and retold by Americans and Islamists alike to illustrate the supposedly unbridgeable values separating Western and Islamic societies. What's funny is that when I teach about this episode in my classes, my students think that it's hilarious because Greeley, Colorado is just down the road from where I teach, and it's sort of like Mayberry. It's not some kind of den of iniquity and sin. It's not Vegas. It's a very sort of staid rural community. In any event, by defining his vision with respect to America, Qutb uses an approach common to secular modernizers in the US and the Arab world. He establishes Americans' savagery by citing their rates of venereal disease, teen pregnancy, and drunkenness. Qutb could admire America's relative mass prosperity. He wrote in Social Justice in Islam, in the first edition, which he completed before setting sail for New York, that an American worker and his family could have a radio set and an automobile and a weekly excursion or a visit to the cinema. This vast workshop successfully mobilized its people to achieve material goals, but it failed to value the spirit. Qutb exhorted his readers to overcome Egypt's staggering inequalities and to construct a more humane society than the one regarded as the world's most developed. Qutb explicitly rejected claims that the US should serve as the model for developing countries. Using a kind of comparison that was employed by other modernizers, including secular modernizers, he contrasted the universality of Islam with the supposedly parochial and bigoted nature of rival modernizing systems. Qutb argued that communism merely served the interests of the Russian state, and if the rest of the world became like America, he wrote, it would be a human catastrophe without doubt. In the case of the US, racism belied Americans' pretensions to offer a universal example. He wrote, Islam became free of tribal and racial partisanship, besides being free of partisanship based on family and lineage, so that it attained a level which Western civilization has not reached even in our day. For this is the civilization which permits the American conscience to engage in an organized extermination of the red Indian race while the rest of the world looks on, just as it permits that miserable discrimination between white and black, a loathsome savagery. Qutb drives the point home with his graphic description of an incident in which a group of whites stomped and kicked a lone Negro youth until the belated arrival of police caused the barbarous crowd to scatter like jungle beasts, his words. Americans' racism had foreign policy implications, as the Turkish troops who served in Korea allegedly discovered, at least according to Qutb. According to him, the Americans found Turks acceptable non-Western allies because they had white skin, but even so deprived them of air support and of adequate food and ammunition during combat. Other Arabs from this writing during the same period criticized America's materialism and social inequalities, but to advance a vision based on secular Arab values. Such a vision drove the career of an Egyptian architect named Hassan Fathy, who was, like Qutb, the Western-educated scion of an elite Egyptian rural family. Fathy advocated culturally appropriate housing for Egypt's rural masses, and his model village at Nugurna, constructed opposite Luxor in the late 1940s, I was just there last month actually, employed local materials of mud brick and handcrafted domed roofs. He hoped that Nugurna would serve as the basis for the reconstruction of villages throughout the Nile Valley and even beyond. He explicitly contrasted his approach with construction projects financed by American Point 4 aid, which spent billions in hard currency on imported materials. By giving residents a role in designing and constructing their own dwellings, Fathy also sought to incorporate individuality and community into modern mass society. Such human values, he wrote, were absent from the visions promoted by both East and West. Inexorably and largely unchallenged, the promoters of sameness, he wrote, have prevailed and have eliminated from modern life the tradition of individuality. Mass communications, mass production, mass education are the marks of our modern societies which, whether communist or capitalist, are in these respects indistinguishable. He lumps them together as similarly materialist and soulless, just as Qutb does. While employed with an Athens development firm called Doxiadis Associates, Fathi came to regard the growing suburban communities of the United States as the antithesis of his plan for housing the world's poor. Like Qutb, Fathi rejected the idea that American society provided a model for developing countries. There's a tendency, he wrote, to take for granted that the type of civilization seen in the USA today, which is indeed the fullest development yet seen of a particular social and technological trend, represents the future for all societies that have not yet reached the USA level. Even those who look beyond the present scene in the USA tend to believe that it is at least a necessary stage in the evolution of societies, and that the countries that are today called underdeveloped must pass through a stage in which their society and urban scene will resemble that of the USA today. This view is surely far too simplistic. The US had become an industrially overdeveloped country, he explained, where man has been subordinated to the machine and the cities designed for cars. Such material abundance actually made the US the most backward country on earth. Suburban communities were segregated on the basis of race and class in order to sustain home values, reducing the family dwelling to a mere consumer product and precluding by design the sort of spontaneous human encounters among people from all walks of life that Fathi associated with Arab villages. Exaggerating these characteristics of American society provided him with a kind of useful anti-example, a dystopia against which to define his own humane alternative. It reduces life, he wrote, to a meaningless and featureless cycle of production and consumption, and turns man into a creature that accepts, that simply exists, with no chance nor even wish to transcend the routine of keeping alive. It's kind of bleak. It was, after all, Arab nationalism, secular pan-Arab nationalism, rather than either of the superpowers' prescriptions, that emerged as this region's dominant post-war modernizing ideology. In this context, some other Arab intellectuals invoked the United States in arguments about the nature of Arab identity and in battles over pan-Arab political institutions. Abu Khaldun Sati al-Husri, born in Sana'a to an Ottoman official from Aleppo, presented a wide array of historical examples to enshrine language as the basis of Arab identity. Al-Husri emphasized the multi-ethnic immigrant character of America, in fact, to draw an absolute contrast with the Arab world meant to underscore the homogeneity of the Arab world. Challenging the argument that America's separation from Britain invalidated linguistic nationalism, Al-Husri cites the large influx of non-English speaking immigrants to portray the United States as a polyglot society. In this sense, there was a tremendous difference, he wrote, between Arab countries and the United States. One of his works also mentions the 2 million Negroes imported into the country, whose black population had reached 10 million at the time that he was writing. The book also features a great sort of fold-out map indicating the diverse influences incorporated into the American Union by way of various territorial acquisitions. Ultimately, Al-Husri borrows manifest destiny, the vision of a country stretching from sea to shining sea, unifying diverse peoples and territories under one flag as, in his words, the most compelling evidence for the benefits of unity. While Al-Husri advocated a pan-Arab state with Egyptian participation, the Iraqi academic and diplomat Abdul Rahman al-Bazaz explicitly identified the United Arab Republic under Nasser's leadership as the basis for such an Arab superstate. Al-Bazaz invoked the US example in his case to define his constitutional vision for pan-Arabism, calling for a muscular Arab federalism similar to that in the United States. He defined his pan-Arab vision with reference actually to both superpowers. On the one hand, he wrote, "The Soviet Union's constitution provided for an authoritarian unitary state while masquerading as a federation of sovereign republics. On the other hand, American federalism had emerged only through a historical process that overcame the emphasis on states' rights and their tendency to regard themselves as states in the international sense rather than in the federal sense." Aside from what he called the color problem, federalism had helped to foster social homogeneity across most states, leaving only minor regional differences. Albazzaz noted that these observations came from experience during a 5-month tour of the United States, his second, about which he planned to write a subsequent book. So he's sort of playing up his American experience to give himself authority for talking about the processes of development. But regarding political economy, regarding economics, Albazzaz argued that Arabs should follow the global trend toward a socialist model. The United States' individualism was the product of greed and the exploitation of its natural resources, which made it exceptional, not exemplary, not a model to be followed. He cited Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal as embodying this principle of individualism. As US modernization theorists did, Albazzaz used America's past and present to envision developing society's future. He shared the assumption that the lessons of American history could be used to accelerate and to shape and to mold developmental processes in other countries. But rather than adopting the US as their model, Albazzaz and other Arab modernizers invoked America as a foil against which to define their agendas, as the anti-example. Talking about Abdulrahman Albazzaz offers a transition into the latter part of my talk. Critics, in my field especially, I know from experience that I'll hear this criticism, might justifiably ask what significance writings by Arab modernizers had for the US relationship with Arab countries, right? After all, the truth is found in the documents in the US presidential libraries and in the American National Archives, right? Well, Albazzaz was more than a pan-Arab nationalist thinker and academic. He was also a politician who had a stormy career in Iraq's tumultuous political life. Following the February 1963 Ba'athist coup, in which Abdul Karim Qasim was murdered, in which the US was almost certainly involved, Bazzaz became Iraq's ambassador to the United Arab Republic. He later served as the Secretary General of OPEC and as Iraq's prime minister. Albazzaz therefore embodies a link between ideas and politics that is standard fare in historians' accounts of US foreign policy during the Cold War period, but this link is largely ignored with respect to so-called third world countries that are portrayed merely as the objects of Americans' modernizing schemes. My aim is to study Arab and American modernizers on an equal basis. Doing so, I think, reveals what post-war modernizers in general shared, and to free the history of the US-Arab encounter from a Cold War framework that is strictly bipolar and in which only Washington and Moscow are the active participants. Okay? So with that as prologue, what does the US-Arab relationship during the Cold War period look like, or what might a new narrative or new account look like? And I'll move on then to my discussion of William Polk. The months surrounding the 1963 Ba'athist coup in Iraq were among the most volatile in post-war Arab politics. By early 1963, Egypt had escalated its support for revolution in Yemen into a Soviet-backed proxy war against Saudi Arabia. On March 8th, a month after the coup in Baghdad, Syrian military officers seized power in Damascus, overthrowing a weak caretaker government led by our friend from the beginning, Khalid al-Azm. Al-Azm had struggled unsuccessfully to reconcile leftist and Islamist members of his coalition. This turbulent season in Arab politics coincided with an appeal by John Kennedy's administration to appeal to Nasser and tried to contain Soviet influence by exploiting the non-aligned character of Arab nationalism. The State Department's top Arab expert, William Rowe Polk, met Arab leaders on a tour of the region in February and March '63. Days before al-Azam was driven from power in Damascus, Polk secretly spoke with a representative of the new Iraqi regime who discussed his government's plans for patching up relations with Egypt. Polk was a scholar diplomat. For suspending and then eliminating Egypt's multi-party political system, Nasser's government appealed to civilian intellectuals on the basis of economic development. Polk regarded the new men as representing the forces of historical change with which the US had to align in order to contain communism, in order to head off a communist future for Egypt. This goal, he argued, took precedence over democracy, which would develop only when a political synthesis conferred legitimacy on this group of new men. In the upheaval of 1963, Polk discerned warnings about how modernization could go terribly wrong. For him, Iraq served, as he wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs, as an example of the most dangerous and destructive way a new synthesis can be sought, if not achieved. Within the Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson administrations, Polk advocated cooperation with Nasser's regime. Polk identified Egypt's development as the key to regional security. Egypt's appalling social and health problems, he wrote, forced the government to seek legitimacy through external confrontations requiring arms from the Soviet Union. Using the promise of economic aid, the US could persuade Nasser to redirect part of Egypt's defense budget toward domestic development and to curb propaganda attacks on the US, on Israel, and on the Arab monarchies. The issue of greatest importance to Polk was restraining Egypt's population growth, which amounted to 600,000 new stomachs every year. Even with Soviet help building the Aswan High Dam, Egypt's living standards were certain to decline unless the population were brought under control. So Polk, like Nasser, made Egyptian development the basis for a political strategy, for his political strategy. Polk enjoyed what he called excellent contacts inside Egypt, and his diplomacy frequently involved debating the nature of development with those new men around Nasser. Early in 1962, Polk met with Egyptian Vice President Zakaria Muhyiddin, the Cairo governor Salah Dessouki, and intelligence chief Sami Sharaf. Later that year, Polk and Walt Rostow invoked US history to convince the Egyptian industry minister Aziz Sidki that raising rural living standards quickly would be to Egypt's economic and political benefit. In the late 19th century, the pair explained, land-grant colleges and the Sears Roebuck catalog had enabled the US to develop an internal market for domestic manufactures, an urgent priority for Egypt in the present. During those chaotic early weeks of 1963, Polk met Egyptian officials, including Hakim Amr, Anwar Sadat, and Nasser himself. In one exchange, Nasser's advisor, Hassan Sabri Akholi, criticized American policy for attempting to hold back the forces of history. He noted that the US supported the Saudi monarchy and other reactionary, unpopular regimes which are destined to be overthrown. Al-Kholi also dashed hope for an early Egyptian withdrawal from Yemen, something that the United States desired very much, proclaiming that 25 or even 50 years would be required to bring Yemen into the 20th century. Though Al-Kholi and Polk both understood development as a linear historical process that could be accelerated through outside intervention, they differed over how to interpret the crisis of Arab modernization. US policy had sought to detach Nasser from Moscow by shifting his attention from regional adventures to domestic development. But Polk feared that Nasser had made exactly the opposite calculation. It is the international significance of the United Arab Republic, Polk wrote, not the tragic social problems of Egypt, which leads the two rival power systems to shower their largesse on Egypt. 3 years a full 3 years before the outbreak of the June 1967 war. Polk predicted in an eyes-only memo to Rostow that an unchecked Arab-Israeli arms race would lead during the president's next term to, in Polk's words, a situation at least as dangerous as Cuba, with perhaps many of the implications of a Vietnam. Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons would throw the UAR into Soviet arms, he wrote, in spite of recent US efforts to free Nasser from Moscow's embrace. What Polk did not foresee, in part because he didn't regard it as an ideological system equivalent to the superpowers, was the way in which political Islam would fill the vacuum left by Nasser's military defeats abroad and economic failures at home. In fact, Nasser's confrontation with an extremist version of political Islam worked against closer US-Egyptian relations. So this has to be, in my view, part of the story of US Cold War relations with the Arab world. Nasser's response to that threat illustrates the ideological matrix in which he formulated Egypt's foreign and domestic policies. Prior to being released from prison in late 1964, Said Qutb authored Milestones, his most radical work, which proclaimed Western democracy as sterile and Marxism defeated. Most threatening to Nasser, of course, Qutb condemned Egypt's government as belonging to the Jahiliyyah, the state of moral ignorance prior to the revelation of Islam, or thereby justifying the regime's destruction. In 1965, Nasser's government accused the Brotherhood of plotting to overthrow the regime and rearrested prominent Brotherhood members. Said Qutb was returned to prison in August 1965. While visiting the Soviet Union later that month, Nasser exposed the plot in a speech delivered to Arab students studying in Moscow. In his address, Nasser referred or discussed the challenges of Arab unity and referred to the pressures that the US had attempted to exert on Egypt through the American food aid program. He then accused Said Ramadan, the exiled son-in-law of Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna, of organizing the anti-regime plot with assistance from what Nasser called colonialism and reaction. Having divulged the Brotherhood plot, Nasser relaxed in the Soviet Union at a hunting lodge with the Soviet leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, and Anastas Mikoyan. The Soviets cautiously supported Nasser's Arab socialism and state political apparatus, the Arab Socialist Union, the ASU, which in their eyes helped to make Egypt into one of the shining examples of the non-capitalist road to development that Soviet theorists had come to accept in the Third World. Nasser, for his part, regarded Arab socialism as an alternative to the superpowers' development formulas and even as a development model for non-Arab societies. Egypt's new pioneering experiment, proclaimed the Charter, setting out Nasser's principles, had already had far-reaching effects on the liberation movement in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Prompted by Soviet ideological shifts, the Egyptian Communist Party dissolved itself in April 1965 in order to merge with the Arab Socialist Union, but the Brotherhood, of course, remained beyond Nasser's control. Zainab al-Ghazali, the female Islamist whom I mentioned in the first part of my talk, who secretly disseminated Milestones, secretly helped to spread it, and accused Egypt's secret police in her memoir of trying to assassinate her, mocked the Arab Socialist Union for what she regarded as its empty slogan of freedom. The semi-official newspaper, Al-Ahram, identified al-Ghazali by name as the direct link between the domestic conspiracy and its foreign sponsors. With negotiations on a new US aid package stalled, Egyptian authorities publicly linked Brotherhood members and other conspirators to the United States. While in Moscow, Nasser implicated the journalist Mustafa Amin, who had been arrested for espionage by the Egyptian police on the 21st of July, 1965, while meeting with a US diplomat. In December, prosecutors announced that Said Ramadan had plotted with figures inside Egypt. He was accused of conspiring with Western intelligence agencies and the US-sponsored Central Treaty Organization, which, according to the indictment, allegedly provided the money. The truth behind these allegations, as is often the case with such allegations, is elusive. In official accounts describing the plot, that is, Egyptian government accounts describing the plot, its scope seems implausible. Among the reputed targets was Kulthum. But journalist from the Wall Street Journal, Ian Johnson, has, in a new book out this spring, has exposed Washington's prior dealings with Said Ramadan. The former Soviet spy, Yevgeny Primakov, argues that the CIA helped to establish the Muslim Brotherhood's Islamic Center in Geneva, which is where Ramadan was based. Whether or not Nasser's government exaggerated the conspirators' plans and their US ties, its prosecution of the Brotherhood involved a careful attempt to balance contending ideological forces. Nasser and Polk, for their parts, remained on good terms, partly because they assessed the crisis of modernization in similar ways. In November '65, just when Brotherhood members were being prosecuted as American spies, the pair debated Walt Rostow's prescriptions for developing countries. Nasser was familiar with Rostow's most famous work, The Stages of Economic Growth, which Al-Ahram had serialized in Arabic, and Polk reported that the Egyptian leader would very much like to have a chance to talk with Walt at considerable length. Nasser also shared Polk's alarm over population growth in Egypt. "I am haunted," the Egyptian leader confessed, "by the birth of nearly 800,000 new people each year." In a later exchange, Nasser linked media consumption to population control, just like a true modernization theorist from MIT or from Michigan State. "You know," Nasser said, "here in the cities, we have the cinema and television to occupy us in the evenings. But in the villages, making love is the only way that a man can find any pleasure." Despite political differences, Polk and Nasser both wanted to transform traditional rural society before it overwhelmed the emergence of a new synthesis. The crackdown on the Brotherhood served to underscore the political dangers of modernization. From the perspective shared by Polk and Nasser, navigating that crisis required not only managing social change effectively, but also defending the authority needed to do so. When Polk left the State Department, he left the Policy Planning Council in 1965, he regarded the Muslim Brotherhood merely as an obstacle to the more hopeful future represented by the new men, rather than as offering a potentially appealing alternative to his secular version of modernization. In the United States and the Arab world, Polk's study, published the year he left the State Department for the University of Chicago, Polk described Egyptian frustration and anguish immediately following World War II as reflected in the rise of such extremists as fascist youth groups and the Muslim Brotherhood. Egyptians, he wrote, now really leaderless, portending the seizure of power in his account by Nasser and other officers, were unable to find a path to their future. Polk stayed committed to his new men thesis, despite problems stemming from Nasser's authoritarian tendencies and the threat represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. During his visit to Egypt in 1965, Polk reported, several old friends were quite bitter about the heavy-handed paternalism of the regime. Such expressions of discontent, except for the residues of the Muslim Brotherhood attempt, Polk wrote, were predictable within the scheme of analysis I developed for Egypt. The country's new men, who were aware of their capabilities and skills in all fields but the political, are restive under the autocracy of Nasser's regime. A synthesis in the form of representative government, he predicted, was in the cards for Egypt over the coming 10 to 20 years. Here's a textbook case, classic case of why historians never, ever should make predictions. Although events did not bear out Polk's expectations, he stayed close to members of the country's Western-educated elite. In 1971, Polk invited Hassan Fathy, the architect who used American suburbia as the foil for his vision of community building, to the Adlai Stevenson Institute on the shores of Lake Michigan to work on village development in Egypt and on an urban renewal project in Chicago's inner city. So, to conclude, using examples that I've shared with you from the Arab Middle East, my research tries to challenge the bipolar and exceptionalist approach employed by Cold War historians who study modernization. Instead of merely a strategic contest between the superpowers, I depict the Cold War in the Third World as the conflict among multiple ideologies contending to reshape post-colonial societies. I also argue that despite pursuing vastly different objectives, Islamists and Pan-Arabists had much in common with US modernization theorists. They shared an understanding of modernity as an all-encompassing social system, a linear conception of historical progress, and the symbolic use of America to define visions of the future. In the way that Polk and Nasser could bond over population control, modernization as a concept united elites from the US with those from developing countries. More than an outgrowth of American liberalism, modernization had a global history in which elites sacrificed their commitment to democratic values as they competed to deliver the benefits of modern society. Facing interrelated struggles for economic development and social authority, many Americans shared with their counterparts from developing countries a willingness to adopt authoritarian means in pursuit of their respective modernizing aims. Working on this research has also been part of a personal quest, struggle, I'm not sure what you would call it, to position myself between the fields of US foreign relations history and modern Middle Eastern history, the fields in which I was trained. By re-examining the history of the Cold War, the dominant topic in American foreign relations history, in the context of Arab countries' post-war struggle for independence and development, I hope to contribute something new to both literatures. I've also found it tremendously rewarding and interesting to learn from and engage with the work of Middle Eastern historians who study the post-1945 period and even the period prior to World War II, historians who have lately taken a greater interest in the history of American foreign policy. This has been maybe one silver lining to the US involvement in the Middle East since 2001. Lastly, and most importantly, this account, my account of Cold War modernization, attaches new importance to the Arab world. Rather than just part of the decolonizing periphery, distinct or special because of oil, because of the conflict with Israel, the Arab Middle East experienced a crush of modernizing ideologies that included iterations of pan-Arab nationalism and political Islam, as well as the superpowers models. Studied with the colonial era antecedents I talked about earlier, this struggle among four ideological systems makes the Arab world central to the history of development in the 20th century. Only by rethinking the bipolar account of the Cold War in the Third World and studying other ideologies on an equal basis with American liberalism and Soviet communism can historians explain the circumstances in which we live today. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions.
So we have time for questions, comments. Dr. Ignacio.
I'm curious, in the discussion of modernization theory, that none of the examples of Bismarckian Germany or Meiji Japan, you didn't refer to them. Did they discuss that? Did they consider that? Or did they fold that into Pan-Arabism?
And you're talking about Arab modernizers,
yeah.
the people I discussed. Some do and some don't. I mean, among those who take a lot of evidence from European history include Al-Husri, who was very interested in linguistic nationalism and who talked a lot about Germany, for example, or even Italy. But others not quite as much. Others were more focused on the United States. It's interesting that Al-Husri and Al-Bazaz in their invocations of the United States that I mentioned invoke the United States in completely opposite ways. Al-Husri invoked it as an example of a multi-ethnic, polyglot society, and Al-Bazaz was at pains to emphasize American homogeneity, which was the result of its legal system in his view. So the U.S. really plays an important role in different discussions of modernization, but by no means exclusive. As I mentioned, Al-Bazaz talked about the Soviet Union and about the welding together of the different Soviet republics. But European evidence shows up an awful lot.
What about Japan, Meiji Japan?
And I think that's terribly important, perhaps maybe for a slightly earlier generation of modernizers, though. I think that those who are writing after 1945 are looking for examples more close at hand, and especially with the United States trumpeting rather loudly its belief that it could serve as a model or a template for the progress to modernity. There are attempts to kind of appropriate that example or refute it or parry it or whatever. So I think that if you're looking at the generation of modernizers who are born prior to 1900, there would be more examples from Meiji Japan, or even from talking about the Ottoman Empire and Republican Turkey.
Yes, what's the connection between refusal of American liberalism and modernization with the American support to Israel? How much did it affect Arab modernizers in their choice?
You know, I think in the .4 era, so that is in the early 1950s, an equal or perhaps even more important factor than the American recognition of and support for Israel are the liberalizing requirements that come along with American aid, the sort of structural adjustments, the sort of structural changes that are required as a condition to receive American aid. If you believe people like Khalid al-Azam, whose memoir I referred to, the Syrian foreign minister, those are the factors that weigh most heavily on his mind. The inability to protect domestic industries, for example, the insistence by the United States on currency convertibility and other kinds of participation, other kinds of multilateral economic agreements. Those weigh more heavily. But you know, certainly the U.S. relationship with Israel is the major factor in the U.S.-Arab relationship after '48.
If I could ask a question.
Please.
This Cold War period, everybody wants some version of modernity, and as you described it as a conflict of these four different kinds in the Arab world.
And none of those is internally monolithic, including American liberalism. There are sort of internal debates over that as well. A bitter Sino-Soviet rivalry, especially by the late 1950s.
Right. So in terms of so in the era, what was assumed is that one form of modernization or another is what is obvious that we all need, and therefore they're all positioning themselves against tradition. And so, I mean, in the trajectory of things since the end of that time, the end of the Cold War, there seems to be a different assumptions being made well, some people might call postmodern or something, that modernity isn't necessarily what we want. But on the other hand, I noticed there are some people who would characterize the conflicts, I mean, as they're seen by people like Huntington as a clash, as a kind of contemporary version of this clash of different modernities. I mean, after all, we still have two of the players in the field. The other ones, I guess, are not completely dead, but and then that brings me to one other final question. what about the revival of Christianity in places like the United States? I mean, is this another version of another modernity?
I think that's an excellent question, and the premise of your question sort of shares a premise with my presentation, and that is that there are sort of global transnational trends that are going on in the 20th century, in which between, say, about 1945 and 1965, the period that I study, were about this concept of modernization or becoming modern. Those who are debating have, in some cases, very dramatically different programs, but they share certain assumptions in common. Certain assumptions sort of cut across different ideological schools, right? In the period after, say, 1970, to be somewhat arbitrary, the kind of modernizing ideologies that promise great things in the preceding generation or preceding 20 years hadn't panned out. And certainly that's true for secular pan-Arab nationalism after June 1967 and even before. I think with the, even in the United States, with the collapse, we might say, or the undermining of sort of New Deal era liberalism, by that same period, people are looking for some other authentic, viable form of being modern. And for some people in the United States, for some people in the Arab world, for some people in the Islamic world outside the Arab world, religion provided that sort of new foundation or new touchstone. That's true perhaps in other settings too, the saffronization of Hindu politics in India or something like that. I think we're sharing a common premise here of these kinds of global and transnational phenomena that cut across cultures, countries, other kinds of political distinctions.
Maybe just to follow up on that a little bit, I think some of the popular conceptions of political Islam is that it's not a modernizing or modernist movement at all, but that it's a traditionalist and perhaps fundamentalist movement. I mean, of course, there are many different iterations of that. But I was wondering then if you could say more about how at least the political Islam, I suppose you're focusing on the Brotherhood, could be seen as indeed a modernizing movement, and you also spoke of some of the social roles that they filled in the absence of Nasser's, what he was failing to do at home in Egypt. So I was wondering if you could say more about both of those sides.
First of all, I'm definitely drafting off of or building on, benefiting from some of the best and most recent scholarship by historians of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so I would include in that group William Shepard, who did a great annotated version of Qutb's Social Justice in Islam. And there are others too. Barbara Zollner's some others. I'm sorry? Shepard. And there are others as well who do portray it as political Islam as a modernizing ideology. And I think it's important to recognize that in this period prior to, during World War II, even in the years after World War II, the literature by people like al-Bakhyakhuli, who I mentioned, sought to elaborate political Islam as a formula for development, as offering a formula or prescriptions for economic development, social justice. Today, I think we tend to think of political Islam as being simply an ideology of resistance or as an ideology of militance or something like that. But the idea that in the 20th century, like other modernizing ideologies, it had a kind of positive economic program, and still does, is something that is important. Something else that bears mentioning is that among historians of the United States, among historians of America, the emergence of a kind of politically conscious evangelical Christianity has been portrayed until relatively recently as something backward-looking and traditional, and not as an alternative modernity. And there are historians. One of the best examples would be Lisa McGurr, who teaches at Harvard and who wrote a book called Suburban Warriors about Orange County, California, who tries to revise this same misconception that you're talking about with respect to American evangelical Christianity, and saying that this is not some kind of backward, traditional movement that's rejecting modernity. It wants to define modernity on its own terms in a way that's very different from what had been the prevailing and dominant definition of modern American society in the 20th century, which was sort of a secular New Deal style liberalism. And so again, my inclination and my instinct here is to not talk about Middle Eastern history or about Islam as being exceptional, or to do the same for the United States or American history or religion in the United States, but to look at these sort of broader connections, larger trends in which both participated. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I think what's interesting is that many of these religions, and most, you know, pointedly, evangelical Christianity invites individuals, as individuals, to reject their complete past and their tradition and begin again and to be born again. And it's, you know, in that sense, it's absolutely anti-traditional.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. And I particularly like the point that you're making about how it's not just this bipolar sort of the American liberalism, Soviet communism, you know, sort of spectrum, but that there are multiple nodes. So my question is, you know, you've got obviously adherents to American liberal ideas, whether they're aware of it or whether they acknowledge this, and Soviet communism, Pan-Arabism, and Islamism. To what degree are these people in conversation with each other? And how do those conversations then impact sort of the context and this historical moment that you're talking about?
I think to answer that question and to do it well would require looking in particular at the period prior to the outbreak of the Cold War, so the sort of colonial era period. And I referred to that a little bit in my talk, but it's something that could be elaborated much more. The way in which Islamists, for example, appropriated the language of Marxism, appropriated the language of class struggle and oppression and so forth. And there are examples of this even in the writings of Qutb and others. There is evidence for sort of American liberals, American Cold Warriors, those who were at least influenced by modernization theory. Polk is one example, who look at what Islamists are writing and are responding to it, are attempting to refute it, sort of not directly. We're not talking about a direct dialogue here, but people who are reading the press, who are reading books, and who are sort of formulating American foreign policy on the basis of what they read. And what you often see in this, you know, this sort of four-way contest, and again, none of these four ideologies is monolithic, and it's important to stress that, is that proponents of a particular ideology will attempt to portray a rival ideological system, as I mentioned, as parochial or as not as universal as the one being advocated, not as universally applicable. And so, to give you an example of sort of American modernization types looking at political Islam and having this reaction, people like Polk, others who were trained in a kind of Orientalist tradition who studied Islamic texts, in the middle of the 20th century were arguing that Islam, and especially sort of the 19th, 20th century political Islam, was sort of imposing an artificial unity on societies that were highly fragmented, and that it served a kind of political, practical political purpose. And so they kind of try to undermine it as being not universally applicable, and having this very kind of instrumental, practical, political purpose in the near term, and claim to represent the true modernity that's going to spring from following American development prescriptions. So that would be one example. In the same way that Qutb said American societies in any kind of universal model, look how racist the Americans are. How do you apply American liberalism to the decolonizing world, which consists of people of color? There was this kind of argument going on almost on every side. Certainly for communists in the Arab world and outside the Arab world, the communism was the great sort of universal modernizing ideology that supposedly didn't see race or didn't see religion, that everybody would be, everyone would benefit from a classless society. But really, to answer this question well, you have to look at the pre-1945 context, and that's something that requires deep reading in political literature by Islamists, by Arab communists, by Arab nationalists.
What is modernity? Is it economic development? Is it radicalism? Is it, for example, high-tech technology? What is modernity?
That's the question I use to begin my course on the modern Middle East. I write that question on the board, and then I turn it back on the... I don't know, and I think that it's kind of a loaded question to say that there's a particular formula that gives you modernity. As a historian, I'm terribly interested in how people have answered that question at different times and how they've acted on the basis of their assumptions. So for the people that I study, the American modernization theorists in the middle of the 20th century, for them, modernity was America. Simple answer, right? Modernity was America. It was something that was the result of these universal processes of change and modernization that every country, every society was engaged in, whether they knew it or not, and they could plot different countries on a kind of scorecard how far they had advanced toward modernity, as represented by the United States. In fact, looking at the records of the Policy Planning Council, the group in the State Department in the United States where William Polk, the guy I mentioned, was the Middle East scholar. They have charts, so they have charts where Egypt will be here and Ghana will be located down here, and it'll have a modernity quotient. There'll be a quantifiable number. How far toward modernity has this particular society progressed? And what people in my field have done a good job of, I think, is of showing how that set of ideas is the product of a particular time, a particular place, and for historians who are interested in understanding sort of how we got to this point, rather than in offering their own prescriptions for the present, I think that kind of research is helpful. I think it also inspires a certain amount of humility. So you could argue that some of the greatest evils in the 20th century were perpetrated under this idea of perfecting society or creating a modern society, no matter what the human cost. And so I think the kind of historical study of how people have answered precisely that question, how that answers have changed over time and what the consequences have been is useful. But I'm a historian, so I'm biased in making that argument, I guess.
I actually wanted to take a step back to the prior question regarding the interaction of these four different categories. Throughout this, you've been talking a lot about the ideologies, but in a more practical political sense, these groups actually had a very tangible interaction as well. I mean, the Nasser and Said Qutb examples, particularly telling Nasser threw him in prison and killed.
Right.
So did you incorporate some of these sort of ideas into your discussions as well? I mean, Syria and Iraq are particularly interesting cases, and Iraq in particular is kind of a bloody one.
Yeah, absolutely. In the case of Iraq, there's sort of another part or element to this talk, which I didn't include because it would have made it even longer than my talk already was, that focuses on Iraq and what's going on during the Abdul Karim Qasim period. Qasim is the brigadier general who, with other officers, seized power in Baghdad in July of 1958, overturned the sort of British-supported monarchy. right in this 59 to 60 period, Iraq became polarized between pan-Arabists and communists. And one of the forums in which there was precisely this kind of interaction, almost a kind of ideological fistfight between pan-Arabists and communists, was in the military court, the so-called People's Court, where the presiding officer was a colonel named Fadl Abbas al-Madawi, who was a cousin of Abdul Karim Qasim's. And Bazaz was one of the star witnesses in that court, and had a kind of series of exchanges with Madawi about the historical forces that were at that moment transforming the Arab world. And so that's one example of a direct confrontation between two very different sort of ideological conceptions of where the Arab world was going. And it's also one in which there are very tragic and very real human political consequences. In February of 1963, there's the coup that's perpetrated by the Ba'ath, in which the U.S. is involved to one degree or another, and thousands of communists get purged. And they're not just sort of hardcore cadres, they're professors of literature and journalists and other people. Proceedings. And so that's one source. Abdul Rahman al-Bazaz, who I mentioned, also wrote a number of sort of autobiographical books and accounts in which he sort of defends himself in his role in Iraqi politics. But that's ultimately the question. How do you get access to good sources?
Amidst these four competing schools of thought, there exist the conservative monarchies that don't fit into any and seem to have survived at least three and perhaps four. How they do it?
That's a very good question. Monarchy, certainly like the Saudi monarchy, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, these are sort of surviving regimes from this period that have outlasted everybody pretty much. And so the question, how did they do it? Deft rulers, help from the United States, an ability to sort of play different rival players internally and externally off against one another, but they are part of the story. They are part of the story. And certainly the intersection between American liberalism, that is an American vision of the world based on economic growth and sort of globalized economic activity, and political Islam, that intersection really is the basis for the story of the U.S. relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and it's one that hasn't fully been told. Although if you look at, if anybody knows the political scientist Timothy Mitchell, he has a very interesting article on Islam as a kind of bulwark of the American role in the Middle East during the Cold War period. But it's a complicated story, certainly a much more complicated story than just four ideologies, certainly a much more complicated story than just the U.S.-Soviet rivalry.
I mean, you talk about the Islamists, the Pan-Arabists, and I mean, they all mainly share, at that time, they kind of shared a more kind of a socialist economic paradigm.
Yes.
My question is, where were the Arab liberals at the time? I mean, did they exist? And if yes, where were they?
Yeah.
I mean, where are their voices? And if not, I mean, why? I mean, especially if you look back at before the Second World War and the period where they had a much stronger voice in the Nahda and other.
The truth is that if you're looking for liberals, sort of American New Deal style liberals, not just in the Arab world, but really in developing countries around the world in the 1950s and 60s, you're really not going to find them. For the United States, acceptable allies, rulers were those who were non-communist or who were anti-communist, and that's what really mattered the most. even those that pursued a kind of protectionist economic policy, by the early 1960s, the United States had endorsed really development plans in places like Turkey, in places like the Philippines, in places like Taiwan that were based on protectionism, that were based on protecting and developing state-sponsored domestic industries. And so it wasn't until somewhat later, really 70s, 80s later, that the United States began pushing a kind of Washington consensus about free trade, multilateral trade, currency convertibility, low government expenditures, that sort of thing. So I guess in economic terms, there weren't too many American-style liberals to be found in the developing world. There were modernizing, authoritarian, anti-communist rulers, which for the United States during the Cold War period was good enough.
Yes. We need history to explain the future. Can we claim, for example, that the failure of the Soviet Nasserite model versus the failure of Sadat liberal model is the reason why we have an emergence of Islam as an alternative in Egypt today, for example?
That's a very big question, and I don't know that I can satisfactorily answer it. Other than to say I think it has to be part of that it has to be a relevant factor. The inability of alternative models to deliver economic development, to deliver a high standard of living and so forth, I think is definitely part of it. Is Iran. I wouldn't think that many Iranians would say that it is, but I don't know that we have really any good examples of Islamic states, delivering some kind of exportable or repeatable or imitatable economic model. It has to be said too that the United States hasn't exactly come up with the magic formula for economic development in the global South. The gap between the haves and have-not countries is a much, much wider gap now than during the period that I was talking about a few moments ago.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.